So at this time, I would like to present Dr. Peter Lindemann.
Thank you, Nola. And thank you all for being here tonight. As you know, this is a private invitation kind of party. And I've been involved in free energy research for about 27 years. And we'll begin tonight where I started back in 1973. Without doing too much other introduction, I'd like to start the process. If we could bring down these lights also. My life changed in the summer of 1973 when I first picked up the National Tatler. In an article authored by reporter Tom Valentine, the headline read, "Man creates engine that consumes no fuel. Invention could change history by 1984. Well, I was young and gullible, but I'd sure never seen a newspaper headline like that before. The article went on to say, a California inventor has found a way to create limitless electric power without using up fuel, potentially the greatest discovery in the history of mankind. Edwin Gray Sr., 48, has fashioned working devices that could power every auto, train, truck, boat, plane that moves in this land perpetually, warm, cool, and service every American home without erecting a single transmission line, feed limitless energy into the nation's mighty industrial system forever, and do it all without creating a single iota of pollution." Well, these are certainly the things that dreams are made of. After discussing a number of things, including the difficulty of raising capital and bringing a working team together, this article goes on to discuss two very interesting tests. What I would like to do is read to you from this article to begin to create the understanding of what this technology is. Reading again from the article, the Tatler was given a thorough demonstration of Gray's impossible but true methods for using electricity. The first demonstration proved that Gray was using a totally different form of electrical current, a powerful but cold form of energy. A 6-volt car battery rested on a table. Lead wires from the battery to a series of capacitors, which are the key to Gray's system. The complete system was wired to 2 electromagnets, each weighing 1.25 pounds. Now, if you tried to charge these magnets with juice from that battery and make them do what I'm going to make them do, you would drain that battery in 30 minutes and the magnets would get extremely hot, Gray explained. I want you to watch what happens. As Fritz Lenz activated the battery, a voltmeter gradually rose to 3,000 volts. At that point, Gray closed a switch and there was a loud popping sound. The top magnet hurled into the air with tremendous force and was caught by Richard Hackenberger. And as you can see right here, this is the magnet after it's been popped up. A terrific jolt of electricity had propelled the top magnet more than 2 feet into the air, but the magnet remained cold. The amazing thing, Hackenberger said, is that only 1% of the energy was used and 99% went back into the battery. The battery can last for a long time because most of the energy returns to it. The secret to this is in the capacitors and in being able to split the positive. When Gray said split the positive, the faces of 2 knowledgeable physicists skewed up in bewilderment. Normally, electricity consists of positive and negative particles, but Gray's system is capable of using one or the other separately and effectively. The next demonstration begins a few paragraphs down. I'll change the slide here. Gray showed this Tatler reporter a small 15-amp motorcycle battery. And by the way, these photographs have never been seen before. They're part of the personal archive of Tom Valentine. It was hooked to a pair of his capacitors, which in turn were hooked to a panel of outlets. He flicked a switch and a tiny battery sent a charge into the capacitors. Then he plugged in 6 15-watt electric light bulbs on individual cords. Unfortunately, the light bulbs are off the screen there, but you can see the cords and the plugs. 110-volt portable television set and 2 radios. The bulbs burned brightly, the television played, and the radios blared, and yet the small battery was not discharging. You couldn't begin to get all this current out of that battery under ordinary circumstances, Gray said. "This is the most amazing thing I've ever seen," exclaimed C.V. Wood, Jr., president of the McCulloch Oil Corporation. He began looking around for hidden outlets from the wall. "May I prove it doesn't come from any wall plug?" Gray offered. A 40-watt light bulb screwed into an ordinary extension socket was plugged into Gray's system. The bulb lit, then Gray dropped it into a cylinder filled with water. "What would be happening if this was getting ordinary power right now?" Gray asked as he stuck his hand in the water with the glowing light bulb. "You'd be electrocuted and that thing would be popping and sputtering until the fuses blew," Wood replied. This reporter then stuck his finger into the water with the light. No shock. And that's Tom Valentine right there with his finger in the water. "Gentlemen, this is a new manifestation of electricity," Hackenberger said. Well, this was quite literally the most amazing thing I'd ever read in a newspaper. I was completely hooked. The next week, I picked up the second article in the series. Here it is. It says, "Miracle no-fuel electric engine can save the public $35 billion a year in gasoline bills." Talks about this amazing new type of electric motor that runs on Gray's system. Here it says, "The silent, pollution-free EMA motor recycles its own energy and can run indefinitely. Gray's prototype is powered by 4 6-volt batteries, which will wear out before they run down." Again, here it says, "The same cold energy repelling magnets arranged on a flywheel run the motor." Hackenberger, an electronics specialist, explained, "A series of high-voltage energy spikes are developed in our circuitry. These energy units are transferred to a control unit, which acts much like a distributor in the internal combustion engine. Every time a magnet is charged, most of the energy is recycled back to the batteries without losing power." These 2 articles, which I ran into when I was 22 years old, completely captivated my imagination. I started talking to my friends about it, and a few months later, my brother and I wrote to Ev Gray Enterprises, expressing our interest and desire to have more information. Here's a copy of the letter I got back from them in October of 1973. It says, "Dear Mr. Lindemann, we would like to thank you for showing such interest in Ev Gray Enterprises and for taking the time to write to us. I have also sent a letter to your brother. But due to our security, we are unable to give out any information about our motor or company." Well, that was disappointing. So these 2 newspaper articles and this letter went into a file. And this was the beginning of my now rather extensive free energy files. Remarkably, these were the only 2 issues of the National Tattler I ever saw. At about that same time, another article came out in a magazine called Probe the Unknown, authored by Jack Scagnetti, called Engine That Runs Itself. And again, it contains very similar kinds of information as the articles by Tom Valentine. In one section, it says, "Gray describes the operation of his EMA motor as similar to recreating lightning." And again, here it says, "Richard Hackenberger, Vice President in Engineering of Ev Gray, explains how the EMA motor system operates. Power from the high voltage section is put through a system of electrical circuitry to produce a series of high voltage energy spikes. The spikes are transferred to a control unit, which in turn operates the motor unit. While this occurs, The recycle regeneration system is recharging the battery with 60 to 100 amp pulses. Now that's impressive. Beyond that, I didn't see anything on Ed Gray for a couple of years. Next thing that came out was this magazine by Tom Valentine called Newsreel. This issue is on a series of suppressed inventions. In here he talks about a wide variety of things, from making oil from coal, making gasoline from water, airplanes that won't stall, and all kinds. Also, here is another update article on Ed Gray. It's called EMS, Electronic Power That Can Change the World's Economic Picture. Here again is another very interesting set of quotes. On page 2 of the article, Gray says, "I remember getting a shock when I grabbed a capacitor off a workbench. That simple fact never left my mind. Then I watched when the government people were testing the first radar across the Potomac River. It stuck in my mind when one of the men explained it as pulse out, pulse back. And I've always been a nut about thunderstorms. I would watch lightning by the hours. I noticed how much stronger it appeared to be when closer to the earth, and just naturally concluded that the more air had something to do with it. These three principles, plus a super secret means of generating and mixing static electricity, make up Gray's EMS motor." And again, later in the article, there's this. "There's no motor like this in the world," Dr. Chalfin told the group. "Ordinary electric motors use continuous current and constantly drain power. In this system, energy is used only during a small fraction of a millisecond. Energy not used is returned to an accessory battery for reuse. It is cool running." Dr. Chalfin added, putting his hand on the motor, "There is no loss of energy in the system." Gray's first patent issued in June of 1975, titled Pulsed Capacitor Discharge Electric Engine. I got my first copy of this patent in 1978. It's a rather extensive patent with 18 pages, 19 illustrations, and 18 claims. It describes an engine that runs by discharging capacitors through electromagnets that oppose each other. I'm sure that most of you have guessed by now that if you try and build this motor according to the principles outlined in this patent, it does not perform anything like what these articles are talking about. And in fact, it does not produce a cold form of electricity. So if you get into the discharge path of those capacitors, it'll throw you across the county. What's more, the amount of energy that you can recycle from this arrangement is negligible compared to what Gray is talking about in these articles. So it became obvious to me quite quickly that in spite of the fact that this patent reveals a great deal about the mechanical arrangements of the motor, it does not reveal the technique of its operation. I was always more interested in the solid-state circuit anyway. I realized that the production of cold electricity really had nothing to do with the motor, that the motor was a secondary event. After all, when Gray was popping the magnets with cold electricity or running the TV and the light bulbs on cold electricity, he didn't need the motor. So it always stuck in the back of my mind that I wanted to understand the solid-state circuit. That was what was important to me. So by the late 70s, I had pretty much exhausted all the information that was available. By the late 1980s, I heard a few rumors that suggested that Gray had been working with the military. But all I knew was essentially that he'd just disappeared. No more news articles or anything else ever appeared about him. Time continued to pass, and by the mid-1990s, another research associate of mine told me that he had heard that Gray had been issued other patents. Now, this was completely intriguing to me, and I knew at some point I needed to get a hold of these documents. But he didn't have them, and he didn't know what the numbers were, and unfortunately, that also turned out to be a dead end in my research. Finally, last summer, in June of 1999, I was on the IBM intellectual property site on the internet, and I noticed that they had just recently updated their search engines within the patent database. For those of you who are not familiar with this database, they have every U.S. patent from 1971 forward online. It was now possible to restrict the search to just the inventor line. And of course, if you plug the word gray into a search and look at every word in every patent from 1971, you get so many hits you can't go through it. But when you could plug in just gray, Edwin into the inventor line in this newly updated search engine, I thought, well, I'll just see what happens. 30 seconds later, the numbers of the two other patents that had issued to Ed Gray came on my screen. I was ecstatic. Here's the first one. Issued in June of 1986, called Efficient Power Supply Suitable for Inductive Loads. This is by far and away one of the most astonishing and important circuits that I had ever seen. Understanding this patent will be the primary focus of the talk this evening. The other patent that issued came approximately 10 months later, in April of 1987. It is called Efficient Electrical Conversion Switching Tube, Suitable for Inductive Loads. These two patents are very closely linked and are almost identical. One of them talks about the circuit that drives this switching tube, and the other one talks about the switching tube itself. About 5/6 of the wording in both of these patents are identical, word for word, paragraph after paragraph. So here is the circuit diagram for the first one. Now we can finally see what Gray was really doing. I had searched 26 years for this diagram. I felt sure that it was the basis of his cold electricity circuits. But Gray was still holding his cards quite close to his chest. Even though the diagram is sitting here, it is not clear how these components behave or what they do or why. The more I studied the text, which is relatively short compared to the motor patent, the more I realized I was looking at something that was really quite foreign to me. Intuitively, I felt I had all the pieces, but I still didn't know how the pieces went together or what the picture looked like. Why was this circuit able to create free energy? There were still far too many unknowns. I was heartened, though, by many of the things that are stated in the patent. Here's one small section. Quote, "There is disclosed herein an electrical driving system which, on theory, will convert low-voltage electrical energy from a source, such as an electric storage battery, to a high-potential, high-current energy pulse that is capable of delivering a work force at the inductive output of the device that is more efficient than that which is capable of being developed directly from the energy source." Now that statement may sound a bit obscure, but actually it's a pretty sneaky way of saying free energy. And again down here, it says, "This system accomplishes the results stated above by harnessing the electrostatic or impulse energy created by a high-intensity spark generated within a specially constructed electrical conversion switching element tube. This element utilizes a low-voltage anode, a high-voltage anode, and one or more electrostatic or charge-receiving grids. These grids are of a physical size and appropriately positioned as to be compatible with the size of the tube, and therefore directly related to the amount of energy to be anticipated when the device is operating." As I continued to read this patent, I was also intrigued by these components here, number 44, number 42, and number 46. Just let me read what the patent says about these. It says, a spark gap protection device, 42, right here, is included in the circuit to protect the inductive load and the rectifier elements from unduly large discharge currents. Should the potentials within the circuit exceed predetermined values, fixed by the mechanical size and spacing of the elements within the protective device, the excess energy is dissipated or bypassed by the protective device to the circuit common, the electrical ground. And again here it says diodes 44 and 46 bypass the excess overshoot generated when the energy conversion switching tube is triggered. So here we have three elements in this circuit which are specifically designed simply to dump excess energy when this tube fires. This sounds like there's the possibility of producing so much energy here that it can damage the rest of the circuit. Well, that was quite promising, but we still didn't really know why that would happen. We didn't understand what was going on. Apparently, something extremely large happens when this conversion switching tube fires. This is obviously the secret of the device. So I was sure I had discovered it. But what I still didn't know what I was looking at. I didn't know why that thing would do what he says it does. I kind of needed a Rosetta Stone. Something that would translate all of these unknowns into an understandable context. Luckily, I found it. That Rosetta Stone is a book called Secrets of Cold War Technology, Project HARP and Beyond, written by Jerry Vassalatos. In Chapter 1, titled Nicola Tesla and Radiant Energy, Jerry recounts those heady days back in 1890, when Nicola Tesla is developing the experiments which lead to the invention of Tesla's magnifying transmitter. For those of you who have not seen this book before, I highly recommend that you acquire and read the entire book. It is an astonishing work, currently available from Adventures Unlimited Press. But for the purposes of tonight's thesis, I would like to read for you selected sections from Chapter 1, which will lay the foundation for you to completely comprehend Tesla's amazing magnifying transmitter, as well as Gray's cold electricity circuit. My recital begins on page 25 of Secrets of Cold War Technology by Jerry Vassalatos. James Clerk Maxwell predicted the possibility that electromagnetic waves might exist. In theoretical discussions designed to more thoroughly explain his mathematical descriptions, Maxwell asked his readers to consider two different kinds of electrical disturbance possibly existing in nature. The first consideration dealt with longitudinal electric waves, a phenomena which required alternating concentrations of electrostatic field lines. This densified and rarefied pulsation of electrostatic fields necessarily demanded a unidirectional field, one whose vector was fixed in a single direction. The only variable permitted in generating longitudinal waves was the concentration of the field. Subsequent propagation along the electrostatic field lines would produce pulsating thrusts of charge, pulsations moving in a single direction. These electrical sound waves were rejected by Maxwell, who concluded that such a condition was impossible to achieve. His second consideration dealt with the existence of transverse electromagnetic waves. These required the rapid alternation of electrical fields along a fixed axis. Space-spreading electrical lines would supposedly bend to and fro under their own momentum, while radiating away at the speed of light from the alternating source. Corresponding forces, exact duplicates of the alternations produced at the source, would be detected at great distances. He encouraged the experimenters to seek this waveform, suggesting possible means for achieving the objective. And so the quest to find electromagnetic waves began. In 1887, Heinrich Hertz announced that he had discovered electromagnetic waves, an achievement at that time of no small import. In 1889, Nicola Tesla attempted the reproduction of Hertz's experiments. Conducted with absolute exactness in his elegant South Fifth Avenue laboratory, Tesla found himself incapable of producing the reported effects. No means, however applied, would produce the effects which Hertz claimed. Tesla began experimenting with abrupt and powerful electric discharges, using capacitors charged to very high potentials. He found it possible to explode thin wires with these abrupt discharges. Dimly perceiving something of importance in these experiments, Tesla abandoned these experiments, all the while pondering the mystery and suspecting that Hertz had somehow mistakenly associated electrostatic inductions or electrified shock waves in air for true electromagnetic waves. In fact, Tesla visited Hertz and personally proved these refined observations to Hertz, who, being convinced that Tesla was correct, was about to withdraw his thesis. Hertz was truly disappointed, and Tesla greatly regretted having to go to such great lengths with such an esteemed academician in order to prove his point. But while endeavoring toward his own means for identifying electrical waves, Tesla was blessed with an accidental observation which forever changed the course of his experimental investigations. In his own attempts to achieve where he felt Hertz had failed, Tesla developed a powerful method by which he hoped to generate and detect real electromagnetic waves. Part of this apparatus required the implementation of a very powerful capacitor bank. This capacitor battery, as he called it, was charged to a very high voltage and subsequently discharged through short copper bus bars. The explosive bursts thus obtained produced several phenomena which deeply impressed Tesla, far exceeding the power of any electrical display he had ever seen. These proved to hold an essential secret which he was determined to uncover. The abrupt sparks, which he termed disruptive discharges, were found capable of exploding wires into vapor. They propelled very sharp shock waves, which struck him with great force across the whole front of his body. They propelled very sharp shock waves, which struck with extreme force. Of this surprising physical effect, Tesla was exceedingly intrigued. Rather more like shotguns of extraordinary power than electrical sparks, Tesla was completely absorbed in this new study. These electrical impulses produced effects commonly associated only with lightning. The explosive effects reminded him of similar occurrences observed with high-voltage DC generators. A familiar experience among workers and engineers, the simple closing of a switch on a high-voltage dynamo often brought a stinging shock, the assumed result of a residual static charging. This hazardous condition only occurred with the sudden application of high-voltage DC. This crown of deadly static charge stood straight out from highly electrified conductors, often seeking ground paths which included workmen and switchboard operators. In long cables, this instantaneous charge effect produced a hedge of bluish needles pointing straight away from the line into the surrounding space. The hazardous condition appeared briefly at the very instant of switch closure, The bluish, sparking crown vanished a few milliseconds later, along with the life of any unfortunate who happened to be so struck. After the brief effect passed, the systems behaved as designed. Such phenomena vanished as charges slowly saturated the lines and systems. After this brief surge, current flowed smoothly and evenly as designed. The effect was a nuisance in small systems, but in large regional power systems where voltages were excessive, it proved deadly. Men were killed by the effect, which spread its deadly electrostatic crown of sparks throughout the component systems. Though generators were rated at a few thousand volts, such mysterious surges represented hundreds of thousands, even millions of volts. The problem was eliminated through the use of highly insulated, heavily grounded relay switches. Former engineering studies considered only those features of power systems which accommodated the steady-state supply and consumed power. It seemed as though larger systems required both surge and normal operative design considerations. Accommodating the dangerous initial supercharge was a new feature. This engineering study became the prime focus of power companies for years afterwards, safety devices and surge protectors being the subject of many patents and texts. Tesla knew that the strange supercharging effect was only observed at the very instant in which dynamos were applied to the wire lines, just as in his explosive capacitor discharge. Though the two instances were completely different, they both produced the very same effects. The instantaneous surge supplied by dynamos briefly appeared super-concentrated in the long lines. Tesla calculated that this electrostatic concentration was several orders of magnitude greater than any voltage which the dynamo could supply. The actual supply was somehow being amplified or transformed. But how? The general consensus among engineers was that this was an electrostatic choking effect. Many concluded that it to be a bunching action where powerfully applied force was unable to move charge quickly through a system. Mysterious, the combined resistance of such systems seemed to influence the charge carriers before they were able to move away from the dynamo terminals. Like slapping water with a rapid hand, the surface seemed solid. So it was with the electrical force, charges meeting up against a seemingly solid wall. But the effect lasted only as long as the impact. Until current carriers had actually caught up with the applied electrostatic field, the charges sprang from the line in all directions. A brief supercharging effect could be expected until charges were distributed, smoothly flowing through the whole line and system. The dynamo itself thus became the brief scene of a minor shock wave. He began wondering why it was possible for electrostatic fields to move more quickly than the actual charges themselves, a perplexing mystery. Was the field itself an entity which simply drove the more massive charges along? If this was true, then of what was the electrostatic field itself composed? Was it a field of smaller particles? The questions were wonderfully endless. Despite the wonderful ideas which this study stimulated, Tesla saw a practical application which had never occurred to him before. Consideration of the dynamo supercharging effect suggested a new experimental apparatus. It was one which could greatly outperform his capacitor battery in the search to find true electrical waves. A simple high-voltage DC generator provided this electrical field source. Tesla understood that the resistance of the lines, or components, viewed from the dynamo end, seemed to be an impossible barrier for charge carriers to penetrate. This barrier caused the bunching effect. Electrostatic charges were literally stopped and held for an instant by the line resistance. a barrier which only existed during the brief millisecond interval in which the power switch was closed. The sudden force application against this virtual barrier squeezed charge into a density impossible to obtain with ordinary capacitors. It was the brief application of power, the impact of charge against the resistance barrier, which brought up this abnormal electrodensified condition. This is why the conductive wires in his present experiment often exploded. The analogy to steam power and steam engines was unmistakable. Large steam engines had to be valved very carefully. This required the expertise of old and well-experienced operators who knew how to open up an engine without rupturing the vessels and causing a deadly explosion. Too suddenly valved, and even a large steam engine of very high capacity could explode. Steam also had to be admitted into a system gently until it began smoothly and gradually flowing into every orifice, conduit, and component. Here, too, was the mysterious choking effect, where a large capacity system seemed to behave like an uncommonly high resistance to any sudden and sustained application of force. The academic world of experimenters was yet fixated on his former discovery of high-frequency alternating currents. It seemed that Tesla alone now exclusively studied these impulse discharges. He was producing explosive impulses which had not been observed in laboratories. Every component was carefully insulated, himself implementing insulated rods and rubberized regalia to ensure complete safety. Tesla had observed electrostatic machines whose ability to charge insulated metals was potent. But this demonstration exceeded the mere charging of wires by the instantaneous switch closure. This effect produced springing charge, phenomena like no other before witnessed by Tesla for its sheer strength. Whatever the conditions observed in previous systems, he had now learned how to maximize the effect. Balancing voltage and resistance against capacity, Tesla learned to routinely produce supercharged states which no existing device could equal. Empirical observation had long taught that ordinary capacitor discharges were oscillating currents, spark currents which literally bounced back and forth between the capacitor plates until their stored energy was wasted away. The high voltage of the dynamo exerted such an intense unidirectional pressure on the densified charges that alternations were impossible. The only possible backrushes were oscillations. In this case, charges surged and stopped in a long series until the supercharge was wasted away. All parameters which forced such oscillations actually limited the supercharge from manifesting its total energetic supply, a condition which Tesla strove to eliminate. Indeed, he spent an excessive time developing various means to block every backrush and other complex current echo which might force the supercharge to prematurely waste its dense energy. Here was an effect demanding a single unidirectional superpulse. With both the oscillations and alternations eliminated, new and strange effects began making their appearance. These powerful and penetrating phenomena were never observed when working with high-frequency alternations. The sudden, quick closure of the switch now brought a penetrating shock wave throughout the laboratory, one which could be felt both as a sharp pressure and a penetrating electrical irritation, a sting. Face and hands were especially sensitive to the explosive shock waves, which also produced a curious stinging effect at close range. Tesla believed that material particles approaching the vapor state were literally thrust out of the wires in all directions. In order to better study these effects, he poised himself behind a glass shield and resumed the study. Despite the shield, both shock waves and stinging effects were felt by the now mystified Tesla. This anomaly provoked a curiosity of the very deepest kind, for such a thing was never observed before. More powerful and penetrating than the mere electrostatic charging of metals, this phenomena literally propelled high-voltage charge out into the surrounding space, where it was felt as a stinging sensation, the stings lasting for a small fraction of a second, the instant of switch closure. But Tesla believed that these strange effects were a simple effect of ionized shock waves in air, rather like a strong ionized thunderclap. Tesla devised a new series of experiments to measure the shock wave pressure from a greater distance. He required an automatic trip switch. With this properly arranged, a more controlled and repetitious triggering of the effect was possible. In addition, this arrangement permitted distant observations which might cast more light on the shield-penetrating phenomenon. Controlling the speed of the high-voltage dynamo controlled the voltage. With these components properly adjusted, Tesla was able to walk around his large gallery spaces and make observations. Wishing also to avoid the continuous pressure barrage of its stinging sparks, Tesla shielded himself with several materials. The arrangement of rapidly interrupted high-voltage direct currents resulted in the radiation of stinging rays, which could be felt at great distances from their super-sparking source. In fact, Tesla felt the stings right through the shields. Whatever had been released from the wires during the instant of switch closure successfully penetrated the shields of glass and of copper. It made no difference. The effect permeated each substance as if the shield were not there at all. Here was an electrical effect which communicated directly through the space without material connections. Radiant electricity. In these several new observations, the phenomena was violating electrostatic charge principles experimentally established by Faraday. Projected electrostatic charges normally spread out over the surface of metallic shields. They do not penetrate metal. This effect had certain very non-electrical characteristics. Tesla was truly mystified by this strange new phenomena and searched the literature for references to its characteristics. In one case, Joseph Henry observed the magnetization of steel needles by a heavy spark discharge. The extraordinary feature of this observation in 1842 lay in the fact that the Leyden jar, whose spark apparently produced the magnetizations, stood on the upper floor of an otherwise electrically impervious building. Brick walls, thick oak doors, heavy stone floors, iron ceilings. Moreover, the steel needles were housed in a vault in the cellar. How did the spark affect such a change through such a natural barrier? Dr. Henry believed that the spark had released special light-like rays, and that these were the penetrating agencies responsible for the magnetizations. A second such account in 1872 occurred in a high school building in Philadelphia. Elihu Thompson, a physicist instructor, sought to make the sparks of a large Ruhmkorff spark coil more visible for his next lecture. Attaching one pole of the coil to a cold water pipe, he reactivated the coil. Thompson was thrilled to find that the nature of the spark had changed from blue to white. Wishing to amplify this effect, Thompson attached the other pole to a large metal tabletop. Again, reactivating the coil produced a shrieking silver-white spark, entirely visible to anyone who sat in the last row. Wishing to show this to a colleague, Edwin Houston, Thompson made for the door and was abruptly stopped. Touching the brass knob on the otherwise insulated oak door, Thompson received an unexpected sizzling shock. Turning off the Ruhmkorff coil, Thomson found it was possible to stop the effect. Calling for Edwin, he summarized what had occurred, then turned the unit back on. The stinging charge effects returned. The two gentlemen ran around the huge stone, oak, and iron building with insulated metal objects now. Each touch of a penknife or a screwdriver to anything metallic, however distant from the coil or insulated from the floor, produced long and continuous white sparks. The account was written up as a short article in Scientific American later in the same year. In studying each of these two prior observations, events which were separated by some 30 years, Tesla perceived an essential unity with that of his own discovery. Each observation was perhaps a slight variant of the very same phenomenon. Somehow, accidentally, each experimenter had managed to produce the explosive supercharging effect. In the case of Dr. Henry, the explosive bursts occurred in a single flash, electrostatic machines being used to accumulate the initial charge. The second case was peculiar, since it evidenced the sustained and continuous production of supercharging effects. The effect was rare because it obviously required very stringent electrical parameters. Tesla deduced this from the simple fact that the effect was so infrequently observed by experimenters all over the world. In addition, he was quick to remark concerning the anomalous attributes attached to the phenomenon. Tesla knew that despite the extremely penetrating effects in each case, he had secured the only means for achieving the complete and maximum manifestation of supercharging. This was an apparatus with no equal, capable of releasing an aspect of the electrostatic field which others had very apparently not had. Though discovered by Tesla in 1889, the preliminary observation of this effect was published after an intense battery of investigations. The Dissipation of Electricity, published just prior to Christmas of 1892, is the pivotal Tesla lecture. This is the departure point in which Tesla abandons research and development of high-frequency alternating current. Divorcing himself from the field entirely, Tesla describes the shock waves and other effects of impulses. In addition to those physical sensations which he describes in characteristic understatements, Tesla also enlarges upon the gaseous aspects associated with the phenomenon. He observed that the abruptly charged wires in his experiments projected a strange gaseous stream when immersed in an oil bath, a phenomena which he once thought due entirely to wire-adsorbed gases. He found that the effect could be so continuously produced from a single wire that no amount of ordinary adsorbed gas could possibly supply the flow. Indeed, he was able to produce streams of this kind in oil which so powerfully projected from the charged wire ends that they visibly depressed the oil into a hole, sometimes 2 inches in depth. Tesla began to realize the true nature of this fine issuing gas, which projected from wire ends immersed in oil. He now prepared an extensive series of tests in order to determine the true cause and nature of these shocking air pulses. In his article, Tesla describes the shield permeating shocks as sound waves of electrified air. Nevertheless, he makes a remarkable statement concerning the sound, heat, light, pressure, and shock, which he sensed passing directly through copper plates. Okay. Collectively, they imply the presence of a medium of gaseous structure, that is, one consisting of independent carriers capable of free motion. Since air was obviously not this medium, to what was he referring? Further in the article, he clearly states that besides the air, another medium is present. Through successive experimental arrangements, Tesla discovered several facts concerning the production of this effect. First, the cause was undoubtedly found in the abruptness of charging. It was in the switch closure, the very instant of closure and break, which thrust the effect out into space. The effect second found no reversal of current was permissible, else the effect would not manifest. In this, Tesla made succinct remarks describing the role of capacity in the spark radiative circuit. He found that the effect was powerfully strengthened when placing a capacitor between the disruptor and the dynamo. While providing a tremendous power to the effect, the dielectric of the capacitor also served to protect the dynamo windings. The effect could also be greatly intensified to new and more powerful levels by raising the voltage, quickening the switch make-break rate, and shortening the actual time of switch closure. Thus far, Tesla employed rotating contact switches to produce his unidirectional impulses. When these mechanical impulse systems failed to achieve the greatest possible effects, Tesla sought a more automatic and powerful means. He found this automatic switch in several electrical arc dischargers. The high voltage output of a DC generator was applied to twin conductors through his new arc mechanism, a very powerful permanent magnet sitting crosswise to a discharge path. The discharge arc was automatically and continually blown out by this magnetic field. Imperative toward obtaining the desired rare effect, the capacitor and its connected wire lines had to be so chosen as to receive and discharge the acquired electrostatic charge in a unidirectional staccato fashion. The true Tesla circuit very much resembles a pulse jet, where no back pressure ever stops the onrushing flow. Electrostatic charge rises to a maximum and is discharged much more quickly. The constant application of high voltage dynamo pressure to the circuit ensures that the continual successions of charge, rapid discharge are obtained. It is then and only then that the Tesla effect is observed. Pulses literally flow through the apparatus from the dynamo. The capacitor, disruptor, and its attached wire lines behave as a flutter valve. The high voltage dynamo remains the true electrostatic source in the apparatus. This is a fact well appreciated by Tesla, who disliked the painful radiant effects proceeding into space. It was evident that the dynamo had somehow been modified by the addition of these pulsing valve circuits. The dynamos being used provided deadly voltages capable of killing a man. The valve circuits were forcing a strange radiance of those deadly field energies. Somehow, the dynamo energy was being expanded into space with dangerous and painful force. But how? By what mysterious and provocative means was this condition established? The result of this experimental series fixed a new concept in Tesla's mind. Tesla had, of course, realized the implications of this mysterious shocking field effect. This was radiant electricity. Tesla first conducted elaborate and extensive investigations in order to comprehend the exact nature of this new electrical effect. Tesla realized that this strange shocking field actually radiated through space from the impulse apparatus. If this was electrostatic energy, it was more intense and more penetrating than any electrostatic field he had ever observed. If this was merely a shuttered electrostatic field, why then was its strength so very intensified? Tesla began to believe that he had discovered a new electrical force, not simply a treatment of an existing force. It is for this reason that he often described the effect as electrodynamic or more electrostatic. By properly adjusting the inherent circuit parameters, Tesla learned how to produce an extremely rapid series of unidirectional impulses on demand. When the impulses were short, abrupt, and precise in their successions, Tesla found that the shocking effect could permeate very large volumes of space with apparently no loss of intensity. He also found that the shocking effect penetrated sizable metal shields and most insulators with ease. Developing a means for controlling the number of impulses per second, as well as the intermittent time intervals between each successive impulse, he began discovering a new realm of effects. Each impulse duration gave its own peculiar effects. Able to feel the stinging shocks, though shielded at a distance of nearly 50 feet from his apparatus, Tesla recognized at once that a new potential for electrical power transmission had been revealed to him. Tesla was first to understand that electrical shock waves represented a new means for transforming the world, even as his polyphase system had already done. Tesla fully intended to disclose his discoveries to the world at large. Radiant electricity had special characteristics of which the scientific world had no knowledge. Working with a simple but powerful embodiment of his original apparatus, Tesla found that radiant electricity could induce powerful electrical effects at a distance. These effects were not alternations, not alternating waves. They were longitudinal waves, composed of successive shocking waves. The advance of each shocking wave, followed by short neutral zones, together comprised the radiant field. Vectorial components of these shock wave successions were always unidirectional. The shuddering shock waves were capable of forcing charge in the direction of their propagation. Objects placed near this device became powerfully electrified, retaining a single charge sign for many minutes after the magnetic disruptor had been deactivated. Tesla found it possible to amplify these single charge effects by a simple asymmetrical alignment of the magnetic disruptor. By placing the magnetic disruptor closer to one or the other side of the charging dynamo, either force positive or force negative vectors could be selected and projected. Thus, charge could be projected into or drawn from any object in the field space. This was a new electrical force. Tesla realized more than ever that he was in unknown territory. The fact that these radiant forces traveled as light-like rays distinguished them from the electromagnetic waves of Maxwell. Tesla wished to determine the effect of gradually decreasing impulse durations, a job that required the greatest skill and precaution. Tesla knew that he would be exposing himself to mortal danger. Controlling the rapidity of current blowout in the magnetic DC arc, Tesla released a new spectrum of light-like energies throughout his large gallery space. These energetic species were like no other which the world has ever seen since. Tesla found that the impulse duration alone defined the effect of each distinct spectrum. These effects were completely distinctive, endowed with strange additional qualities never purely experienced in nature. Trains of impulses, each exceeding 0.1 milliseconds in duration, produced pain and mechanical pressure. In this radiant field, objects visibly vibrated and even moved as the force field drove them along. Thin wires exploded into sudden bursts of the radiant field. Pain and physical movement ceased when impulses of 100 microseconds or less were produced. With impulses of 1 microsecond duration, strong physiological heating was sensed. Further decreases in impulse duration brought spontaneous illuminations capable of filling rooms and vacuum globes with white light. At these impulse frequencies, Tesla was able to stimulate the appearance of effects which are normally admixed among the electromagnetic energies inherent in sunlight. Shorter impulses produced cool, room-penetrating breezes with an accompanying uplift in mood and awareness. There were no limits in this progression towards impulses of diminished duration. None of these impulse energies could be duplicated through the use of high-frequency harmonic alternations. Few could produce these effects because so few understood the absolute necessity of observing those parameters set by Tesla. These facts have been elucidated by Eric Dollard, who also successfully obtained the strange and distinct effects claimed by Tesla. By 1890, after a period of intense experimentation and design development, Tesla summarized the components necessary for the practical deployment of a radiant electrical power distribution system. Tesla had already discovered the wonderful fact that impulse durations of 100 microseconds or less could not be sensed and would do no physical harm. He planned to use these in his power broadcasts. Furthermore, shocking waves of 100 microsecond duration passed through all matter, a fitting form of electrical energy to broadcast through a power-hungry city. Tesla made a most startling discovery the same year, when he placed a long, single-turn copper helix near his magnetic disruptor. The coil, some 2 feet in length, did not behave as did solid copper pipes and other objects. The thin-walled coil became ensheathed in an envelope of white sparks. Undulating from the crown of this coil were very long and fluidic silver-white streamers, soft discharges which appeared to have been considerably raised in voltage. These effects were greatly intensified when the helical coil was placed within the disruptor wire circle. Inside this shock zone, the helical coil was surrounded in a blast which hugged onto its surface and rode up the coil up to its upper end. It seemed as though the shock wave actually pulled away from surrounding space to cling to the coil surface, a strange, attractive preference. The shock wave flowed over the coil at right angles to the windings, an unbelievable effect. The sheer length of the discharges leaping from the helix crown was incomprehensible. With the disruptor discharge jumping 1 inch in its magnetic housing, the white flimmering discharges rose from the helix to a measured length of over 2 feet. This discharge equaled the very length of the coil itself. It was an unexpected and unheard of transformation. Here was an action more nearly electrostatic in nature, although he knew that academes would not comprehend this term when used in this situation. Electrostatic energy did not fluctuate, as did his shock waves. The explosive shock wave had characteristics unlike any other electrical machine in existence. Yet Tesla stated that the shock wave, during the brief instant in which it made its explosive appearance, more nearly resembled an electrostatic field than any other known electrical manifestation. Just as in electrostatic friction machines, where current and magnetism are negligible, a very energetic field component fills space in radiating lines. This dielectric field normally launches through space in a slow growth as charges are gathered. Here was a case where a DC generator provided the high voltage. This voltage charged an insulated hoop of copper, growing to its maximum value. If all values in the circuit were properly balanced, in the manner prescribed by Tesla, a sudden charge collapse would then occur. This collapse was necessarily very much shorter than the interval required to charge the loop. The collapse comes when the magnetic disruptor extinguishes the arc. If the circuit is properly structured, no backrush alternations ever occur. This unidirectional succession of charge-discharge impulses causes a very strange field to expand outward, one which vaguely resembles a shuddering or staccato electrostatic field. But these terms did not satisfactorily describe the conditions actually measured around the apparatus, a powerful radiant effect exceeding all expectable electrostatic values. Actual calculation of these discharge ratios proved impossible. Implementing the standard magneto-inductive transformer rule, Tesla was unable to account for the enormous voltage multiplication effects. Conventional relationships failing, Tesla hypothesized that the effect was due entirely to radiant transformation rules, obviously requiring empirical determination. Subsequent measurements of discharge lengths and helix attributes provided the necessary new mathematical relationships. He had discovered a new induction law, one where radiant shock waves actually auto-intensified when encountering segmented objects. The segmentation was the key to releasing the action. Radiant shock waves encountered a helix and flashed over the outer skin from end to end. This shock wave did not pass through the windings of the coil at all, treating the coil surface as an aerodynamic plane. A consistent increase in electrical pressure was measured along the coil surface. Indeed, Tesla stated that voltages could often be increased at an amazing 10,000 volts per inch of axial coil surface. This meant that a 24-inch coil could absorb radiant shock waves, which initially measured 10,000 volts, with a subsequent maximum rise to 240,000 volts. Such transformations of voltage were unheard of with apparatus of this volume and simplicity. Tesla further discovered that the output voltages were mathematically related to the resistance of the turns in the helix. High resistance meant higher voltage maxima. He began referring to his disruptor line as his special primary, and to the helical coil placed within the shock zone as his special secondary. But he never intended anyone to equate these terms with those referring to magnetoelectric transformers. This discovery was indeed completely different from magnetoinduction. There was a real and measurable reason why he could make this outlandish statement. There was an attribute which completely baffled Tesla for a time. Tesla measured a zero current condition in these long copper secondary coils. He determined that the current which should have appeared was completely absent. Pure voltage was rising with each inch of the coil surface. Tesla consistently referred to his electrostatic induction laws, a principle which few comprehended. Tesla called the combined disruptor and secondary helix a transformer. Tesla transformers are not electromagnetic devices. They use radiant shock waves and produce pure voltage without current. Each transformer conducted a specific impulse duration with specific force. Therefore, each had to be tuned by adjusting the disruptor to that specific impulse duration. Adjusting the arc distance provided this control factor. Once each transformer was tuned to its own special response rate, impulses could flow smoothly through the system, like gas flowing through a pipe. Finding the gas dynamic analogies and applications indeed provided him with a consistent record of successful assessments of these regards. Tesla began considering whether or not the white flame discharges, so different from anything that he had ever seen, might not be a gaseous manifestation of electrostatic force. There were certainly abundant experimental instances in which a purely gaseous nature, so unlike anything electrical, was being clearly made manifest. The manner in which the radiant shock wave traveled over the wire coilings in white flimmering laminar sheets brought a new revelation of thought. Voltage pulses traversed the secondary surface like a gas pulse under increasing constriction. Until reaching the free end of the coil, these gaseous pulses flowed over the copper surface rather than through it. Tesla referred to this specific manifestation as the skin effect. In this, the discharge greatly resembles the manner in which gases move over surfaces aerodynamically. Furthermore, whenever a metal point was connected to the upper terminal of one of his transformers, the stream became more directive. It behaved just like a stream of water in a pipe. When the white flimmering stream was directed at distant metal plates, it produced electronic charges. This charge production could be measured as amperage, current at the reception site. In transit, however, no such amperage existed. Amperage appeared only when intercepted. Eric Dollard has stated that the space surrounding Tesla impulse transformers so surge with these streams that the interception currents can reach several hundred or even several thousand amperes. But what was this mysterious stream composed? Tesla struggled with the doubt that these discharge phenomena might be ordinary electricity behaving in extraordinary ways. But did electricity indeed have a smooth, soft, and flimmering nature? The electricity with which he was familiar was shocking, hot, burning, deadly, piercing, stinging, all the attributes of an irritant. But this discharge phenomena, whether cool or warm to the touch, was soft and gentle, and it would not kill. Even the manner in which the pulse exploded as bright white discharges of greatly transformed voltage suggested the way in which gases behave when released from their confinements under pressure. These reflective meditations convinced Tesla that this effect was not purely electrical in nature. Closely examining the white flames, Tesla realized why there was no measurable electric current in the crown of these activated coils. The normal heavy charge carriers, electrons, could not travel as quickly as the radiant pulse itself. Choked in the metallic lattice of the coil, electrons became immobile. The radiant pulse which moved over the coil's surface was therefore not electronic in nature. Additionally, Tesla discovered an amazing phenomena which removed all doubt concerning the true nature of the energetic carriers at work in his apparatus. Tesla arranged a very heavy U-shaped copper bus bar connecting both legs directly to his disruptor primary. Across the legs of this U-shaped bus bar were placed several incandescent lamps. The arrangement was a very evident short circuit. The lamps were illuminated to a bright, cold, white light while being shorted by a heavy copper shunt. Uncharacteristic of particulate current electricity, the bright but cold lamps revealed that another energetic current was indeed flowing through the short circuits. Those who observed this experiment did not expect it to perform any function save the incineration of the disruptor circuit and possibly of the dynamo itself. Instead of this, witnesses beheld a marvel. The lamps lit to an uncommon brightness. In this simple demonstration, Tesla was illustrating but one of his many evidences. Electronic charges would prefer the least resistant circuit, rejecting the incandescent bulbs for the copper path. The circuit in this situation chose to conform to a contradictory principle. Perhaps this was true because the current were not electrical. Tesla repeatedly used this demonstration to evidence the fractionation of currents electronic from currents neutral. A single question remained, the answer to which would provide him with the essential information needed to create a new technology. What so separated or fractioned the diverse mobile carriers in his transformer? It was the geometric configuration of the coil, which inadvertently separated each component. Electrons were blocked from flowing through the wire length, while the radiant pulse was released over the coil's surface as a gaseous pulse. Electrons could not drift through the wire, but during each impulse period, they were blocked by the line resistance. Thus, the gaseous mobile carriers were released to flow outside the wire, a pulse which traveled along the outer coil surface from end to end. Here then was evidence that electrical discharges were indeed composed of several simultaneous mobile species. Tesla now comprehended why his first high-frequency alternating currents never evidenced these powerful actions. It was the abruptness, the violence of the impulsive discharge which gave free mobility to this unsuspected gaseous component. Impulses, unidirectional impulses, were the only means by which these potentials could be unlocked. Alternations were absolutely useless in this regard. Moreover, because alternations could not unleash the secondary gas dynamic component, it remained an unusable and pitifully weak means. Tesla forever viewed his high-frequency alternating devices as failed projects. This has great bearing on his highly critical views of Marconi and all others like him who pursued high-frequency alternating wave radio. Tesla began to study a topic which has found more enemies and critics than any this century. Tesla, with great interest now, began researching the ether. Tesla came to believe that dielectric fields were actually composed of ether streams. Theoretically, then, one could derive limitless energy by trapping and conducting a naturally occurring dielectric field line. The problem was that no ordinarily accessible material could resist the ether enough to derive any momentum from it. With a stream so rare as to pass through all known materials, the kinetic energy inherent in dielectric field lines would remain an elusive energy source. Tesla believed he may have found the secret to tapping this energy, but it would not require an ordinary kind of matter. Tesla viewed voltage as streams of ether under various states of pressure. Raising these stresses could produce enormous ether streams, where the observed voltage would then be extremely high and luminous. This was the very condition which Tesla had come to believe had been established in his transformers. In fact, Tesla repeatedly stated that his transformers affected powerful movements in the ether. In one truly mystifying experiment, indicative of these comprehensions, Tesla describes the production of very rapid impulse trains with the subsequent production of a cool, misty white streamers extending a yard into space. These were cool to the touch and harmless. If electrical in nature, they would necessarily have been several million volts in potential. Their harmlessness is coupled with their sinuous nature, one completely unlike electrical currents. Indeed, to understand Tesla technology, one must eliminate the notion that electrons are the working fluid in his radiant electric systems. With the lower coil end connected directly to the dynamo, high-voltage ether streams were projected from the upper terminal. When describing each of his relevant patents in this new technology, Tesla forever spoke of light-like rays and the natural medium. The first term refers to the tightly constricted ether streams, which are propelled from his transformers along infinitesimal ray lines, and the latter refers to the all-pervading ether atmosphere in which his technology operated. It is impossible to comprehend Teslian technology apart from the controversial topic concerning the ether. Many analysts will reject the concept without first seeking out and discovering the proofs which have been established by experimenters such as Eric Dollard. Tesla addressed the notion that ether streams were being pulled through his transformers, drawn in at higher natural pressure, and accelerated to a sharp electrical discharge. As electrical systems, Tesla apparatus cannot completely be understood or explained. One must view Teslian technology as an ether gas technology, one capable of being explained only through gas dynamic analogies. It was now easy to understand how such projected rays, ether gas streams under high pressure, could penetrate metals and insulators alike. These powerful rays often could penetrate certain materials with inexplicable efficiency. Electricity did not perform these wonders. Tesla also now understood why these discharge streams produced their smoothly hissing sounds, visibly appearing like gas jets under high pressure. Ether gas under pressure. Tesla was completely mystified. He had successfully released the mystery current, normally suppressed and bound in electronic charge carriers. Unidirectional, impulsive discharges of high voltage and abrupt durations released them. What other potentials would ether gas technology release? The original cylindrical coils were quickly replaced with cone-shaped coils. With these bizarre geometries, Tesla was able to focus the gas dynamic component, which now rose up like a jet of hissing white light from the coil tip. Tesla recognized that these discharges, white, spectacular, and awe-inspiring, actually represented lost power. A power broadcast station had to evenly disperse the energetic radiance in all directions. Flame-like discharges caused the available power to undulate in space. This would produce unpredictable power drops at long distances. Consumers would not receive a reliable and consistent stream of energy. If his power transformer was to operate with highest broadcast efficiency, these flame-like discharges necessarily had to be suppressed. But suppressing these excessive ether jets proved problematic. Tesla found that the white flimmering streams were absorbed in large capacity volumes, masses in which the streams were absorbed, filtered, and expelled. The use of copper spheres atop his transformers forced the streams sufficiently apart to suppress the white flame. Power was now evenly dispersed throughout space as required. But a new problem appeared. The copper spheres, being impacted by the high voltage streams, which were composed now of where the forces were now conduct, expelled electronic components. These appeared along with the radiance, producing truly dangerous conditions. The problem was stimulated by conduction, a case where the spherical copper ball was impacted by ether throughout its volume. The white flimmering streams permeated the copper and expelled electrons. These contaminants concentrated their escape from the system as harmful blue stinging dartlets. By comparison, the white flame discharge was smooth and harmless glow. Comparing the two species, Tesla recognized the difference in charge carriers. Tesla was once nearly killed when one such dartlet jumped 3 feet through the air and struck him directly over the heart. The copper spheres had to be removed and replaced by another dispersion component. Metals were apparently of no utility in this case, being natural reservoirs of electrons. Tesla eventually suggested that metals manufactured electrons when impacted with these special flame-white currents, the carriers in the white flames becoming concentrated within the metallic lattice. He had already observed how the very air near the transformers could be rendered strangely self-luminous. This was a light like no high-frequency coil ever could produce, a corona of white brilliance which expanded to ever larger diameters. The light from Tesla transformers continually expands. Tesla described the glowing column of light which surrounds any elevated line which is connected to one of his transformers. Unlike common high-frequency alternations, Tesla radiant energy effects grow in time. Tesla recognized the reason for this temporal growth process. There were no reversals in the source discharges. Therefore, the radiant energy would never remove the work performed on any space or material so exposed. As with the unidirectional impulse discharges, the radiant electric effects were additive and accumulative. In this respect, Tesla observed energy magnifications which seemed totally anomalous to ordinary engineering convention. It was easy to control the brilliance of a room by controlling the voltage in his transformers. The light from this sort of illumination was curiously bright to human perception, but nearly impossible to photograph on film. Tesla found it necessary to make long time exposures of his discharges before the faintest sort of streamers could be made visible. This strange inability to register photographically was contrasted against the brilliance perceived in the eyes, one which required delicate control. Tesla also designed, built, and utilized large globe lamps, which required only a single external plate for receiving the radiant energies. However distantly placed from the radiant source, these lamps became brilliantly illuminated. Theirs was a brilliance approaching that of an arc lamp and exceeding any of the conventional Edison filament lamps by several factors. It was also easy for Tesla to control the heat of any space. By controlling both the voltage and impulse duration of energy in his transformers, Tesla could heat up a room. Cool breezes could also be arranged by appropriately setting the impulse duration. The key to producing all etheric action was to secure a means for actually affecting etheric deviations, the very thing now possessed by Tesla alone. Sir Oliver Lodge stated that the only means for getting at the ether was an electrical means, but not one member of the Royal Society of London had been able to achieve this feat, with the rare exception of Sir William Crookes. The Tesla method used ether to modify ether. The secret was separating the contaminants from the etheric current at the very source of generation, a feat which he had achieved in his transformers and magnetic arc disruptors. Tesla used the violence of magnetically disrupted arc discharges to chaoticize electronic and etheric carriers in metallic conductors, breaking the agglomerations which bind them together. Each component was free to separate. This condition could not be achieved in arc discharges where currents were allowed to alternate. In such apparatus, the electronic carriers overwhelmed the release of ether, and while ether was present in the discharge, could never be separated from the composite current. the extraordinary efficiency of the magnetic arc disruptor in developing etheric currents derived from several principles. Tesla saw that electrical current was really a complex combination of ether and electrons. When electricity was applied to the disruptor, a primary fractioning process took place. Electrons were forcibly expelled from the gap by the strong magnetic influence. The ether streams, neutral in charge, remained flowing through the circuit. The magnetic disruptor was his primary means for fractionating the electrons from the ether particles. Ether particles were extremely mobile, virtually massless when compared with electrons, and could therefore pass through matter with very little effort. Electrons could not keep up with either the velocity or the permeability of etheric particles. According to this view, ether particles were infinitesimals, very much smaller than electrons themselves. The etheric carriers contained momentum. Their extreme velocity matched their nearly massless nature, the product of both becoming a sizable quantity. They moved with superluminal velocity, a result of their incompressible and massless nature. Whenever a directed radiant matter impulse begins from some point in space, an incompressible movement occurs instantaneously through space to all points along that path. Such movement occurs as a solid ray, an action defying modern considerations of signal retardations in space. Incompressible ray lines can move through any distance simultaneously, instantly. Should the path be 300,000 kilometers long, the impulse at the source end will reach that point as quickly as at all other points. This is superluminal velocity, instantaneous propagation. Radiant matter behaved incompressibly. In effect, this stream of radiant matter, virtually massless and hydrodynamically incompressible, was a pure energy, radiant energy. Here was a distinct phenomenon, one which did not in fact manifest with other than impulse applications. Tesla alternately called these pure etheric expulsions radiant matter and radiant energy. Neutral in charge and infinitesimal in both mass and cross-section, radiant energy was unlike any light seen since his work was concluded. Asked if radiant energy can be compared with any existing physical item today, one would have to decline. We cannot draw parallels between radiant energy and the light energies which science has long been preoccupied. But if light-like at all, radiant energy is possessed of qualities unlike any light which we have learned to generate. And this is precisely the problem. Tesla technology is impulse technology. Without the disruptive, unidirectional impulse, there are no radiant energy effects. Generating this radiant energy requires special energetic applications of succinct and brief impulses. These impulses must be generated through the explosive agency of a disruptive discharge, just as Tesla described. This concludes that portion of the book, Secrets of Cold War Technology by Jerry Vassilatos, which I care to enter into our discussion this evening. In spite of the length of this recital, I have actually edited out a number of concurrent themes to focus strictly on the material that I thought immediately relevant to tonight's thesis. Anyone interested in advanced electrical science or even accurate scientific history should read and study this volume. I have for the last couple of months tried to acquire a copy of Tesla's lecture, The Dissipation of Electricity. So far, I've been unsuccessful, so I can't go back to that document to verify Jerry's analysis. However, I felt that it was such a different way of looking at Tesla's work that I simply could not ask you, the audience, just to take it on faith that these are the facts. I was forced to go back through the kinds of material that almost anyone has available on Tesla these days, including the very large volume Nicola Tesla Lectures, Patents, Articles. And I was able to find what I believe is more than enough evidence to support Jerry's analysis of Tesla's work. What I would like to share with you now are some of those documents, and I promise we'll get back to gray soon enough. This quote is taken from Tesla's article, The Problems of Increasing Human Energy, that first appeared in Century magazine in June of 1900. And I'm going to read to you what's in this yellow box here, and it says, Since I described these simple principles of telegraphy without wires, I have had frequent occasion to note that the identical features and elements have been used in the evident belief that the signals were being transmitted to considerable distances by Hertzian radiations. This is only one of the many misapprehensions to which the investigations of the lamented physicist have given rise. About 33 years ago, Maxwell, following up on the suggestive experiment made by Faraday in 1845, evolved an ideally simple theory which intimately connected light, radiant heat, and electrical phenomena, interpreting them as being all due to vibrations of a hypothetical fluid of inconceivable tenuity called the ether. No experimental verification was arrived at until Hertz, at the suggestion of Helmholtz, undertook a series of experiments to this effect. Hertz proceeded with extraordinary ingenuity and insight, but devoted very little energy to the perfection of his old-fashioned apparatus. The consequence was that he failed to observe the important function which the air played in the experiments, and which I subsequently discovered. Repeating his experiments and reaching different results, I ventured to point out this oversight. The strength of the proofs brought forward by Hertz in support of Maxwell's theory resided in the correct estimate of the rates of vibration of the circuits he used. As I ascertained that he could not have obtained the rates he thought he was getting, the vibrations with identical apparatus he employed are, as a rule, much slower, this being due to the presence of air, which produces a dampening effect upon a rapidly vibrating electrical circuit with high pressure, as a fluid does upon a vibrating tuning fork. I have, however, discovered since that time other causes of error, and I have long ago ceased to look upon his results as an experimental verification of the poetical concepts of Maxwell. The work of the great German physicist has acted as an immense stimulus to contemporary electrical research, but it has likewise, in a measure, by its fascination, paralyzed the scientific mind, and thus hampered independent inquiry. Every new phenomena which was discovered was made to fit the theory, and so, very often, the truth has been unconsciously distorted. Well, obviously Tesla did not agree with the work of Helmholtz, Hertz, and Maxwell. For anyone out there in the audience who does not know who these people are, Hermann von Helmholtz is the author of what is now known the first law of thermodynamics, which states that energy can be changed from one form to another, but it is neither created nor destroyed. James Clerk Maxwell's equations are the backbone of modern electromagnetic theory. And Heinrich Hertz's supposed verification of Maxwell's work was deemed so important that they named the measurement of frequency after him. So these esteemed gentlemen are pivotal personalities in the way science is taught today. But as we can see, Tesla dismissed them all as not being relevant to his experimental findings. In other words, if we follow this path back into the ethers, we must be willing to leave behind the ideas and limitations defined by the first law of thermodynamics and Maxwell's equations. Amen. What we are going to look at lies outside the realm where these tools are useful. We're going to move into a completely different realm of study. Moving on, here is a closing remark from another article published in March of 1904. Tesla states, "When the great truth, accidentally revealed and experimentally confirmed, is fully recognized that this planet, with all its appalling immensity, is to electrical currents virtually no more than a small metal ball, and by this fact many possibilities, each baffling imagination and of incalculable consequence, are rendered absolutely sure of accomplishment. When the first plan is inaugurated, and it is shown that a telegraphic message, almost as secret and non-interferable as a thought, can be transmitted to any terrestrial distance, the sound of the human voice, with all its intonations and inflections, faithfully and instantly reproduced at any other point on the globe. The energy of a waterfall made available for supplying light, heat, or motive power anywhere on land or sea or high in the air. Humanity will be like an ant-heap stirred up with a stick. See the excitement coming." Well, here it sounds like Tesla really has something astonishing. He understands it, and he expects it to be unlimited. Something that is way beyond anything that has been ever done before. Even now, we're only getting to a place in the world 100 years later where many of these situations are possible. At least as far as transmitting human voice and things like this, but certainly not with regard to energy being available everywhere on land, sea, or air. Clearly, Tesla is referring to something that was not brought into full public manifestation. So the question is, what was Tesla doing? What evidence do we have that Tesla was working on the kinds of systems that Mr. Vassilatos was talking about in his book? Let's quickly review the evidence that Tesla was working on circuits with spark gaps and trying to get higher and higher spark gap discharge speeds. Here we have one of his many patents in the Lectures, Patents, Articles books called Electrical Circuit Controller. This is one that's very interesting because it consists of two electric motors, each turning in opposite directions. And a spark gap in between the two moving members. So he was clearly trying to get higher and higher speeds than just rotating one member. These would rotate in opposite directions. So here is clear evidence where we have a mechanical spark gap controller, as Jerry suggested in his early work, that he's trying to get the speed as high as he possibly can. Here's an illustration of a magnetically quenched spark gap. It doesn't use permanent magnets, it uses electrical magnets, because later in his experiments he wanted to vary the strength of that to help tune his circuits. This is one of the many experiments to blow out or quench a spark discharge. You'll see this one's very interesting because it is obviously designed for a DC spark, because DC spark discharges didn't start very easily. And you can see the spring-loaded handles here. You could tap on one end of one of these and bring the spark mechanisms closer together to start to draw the initial spark. Then they would spring back to their preset distances so you could get a DC spark discharge started under these very difficult conditions. Here's another illustration where Tesla is blowing hot air across a spark discharge path. And actually, when you read about this one in the text, there's also a magnetic field present. So here he's using both hot air and magnetic field with a spark gap in this apparatus. So he's clearly looking into a wide variety of possibilities to get more controllable spark discharges, and very obviously DC spark discharges with high voltage. Here's the cover sheet of the patent called Electrical Transformer. In this he states that this is the invention that he plans to employ in constructing improved coils and a manner of using them for transmitting energy over long distances. I've included the illustration from this patent, and we can clearly see that he has the construct that Jerry was talking about, just a few turns in the primary and a conical coil in the secondary. So all the structures that Jerry was talking about here are present. Here we have another patent, Tesla patent, called Art of Transmitting Electrical Energy Through the Natural Mediums. And here again we see the same basic structure of source B here, powering a two-turn primary with a spiral coil in the middle of it. In this case, this was for broadcasting energy. So E prime down here is the connection to the Earth, and E up here is what he called his elevated capacitance. This was the heart of the magnifying transmitter system to broadcast energy to all points on the planet that he attempted to construct at Wardenclyffe, New York. Now, what was interesting about this is his source for this system, B. When you look at this diagram, B looks like a simple generator. But let's go back to the patent and read about this. Here we have some of the text from that patent, and it states right here, in Figure 1, A designates a primary coil forming part of a transformer and consisting generally of a few turns of stout cable of inappreciable resistance, the ends of which are connected to the terminals of a source of power for electrical oscillations, diagrammatically represented by B. This source is usually a condenser charged to a high potential and discharged in rapid succession through the primary, as in a type of transformer invented by me. So I've pulled this little diagram out, and the one on the left here is the one that's directly from the patent, and the one on the right here is what I call Tesla's magnifying transmitter illustration as described in the patent text, showing the capacitor and the disruptive spark gap, in this case a magnetically quenched gap, so he could control the impulse characteristics the way he wanted. Is everybody okay with this? I don't want to change the master's work here, but this is really the circuit he was using. And he used this drawing to just obscure it, but he clearly describes it in the patent. And again, quoting from the text of this patent, a little later, Tesla claims, I have found it practicable to produce in this manner an electrical movement thousands of times greater than the initial. So again, he's talking about a tremendous gain in electrical energy here. And going a little bit further up, starting about here, it says, these adjustments and relations being carefully completed and other construction features indicated rigorously observed, the electrical movement produced in the secondary system by the inductive action of the primary A will be enormously magnified. Tesla obviously believed and stated repeatedly that this system was capable of producing more energy out than he was putting in. Today, we call that free energy. Here is more evidence that Jerry's analysis is correct. Again, we go back to the source and we see in this section, here he says, on the apparatus and method of conversion. Conversion of what? Conversion of ordinary electricity into this new form. And we see this generator here, and on the right, or on the left over here, these are systems that are operating on AC. You can see the slip ring brush is correct. And on this side, it's all running on DC, and you can see the commutator. And then there's a little D here and a little A here, so those are the nomenclature. And what we see on the close-up on the DC side, here, this central one here, I'd like to take a look. Here we see a close-up on the DC side. He's taking direct current, running it through another apparatus that the text tells us raises it to an even higher direct current voltage. He charges a capacitor and puts that through a magnetically quenched spark gap to run light bulbs and other apparatus. So here we have direct evidence in Tesla's published writings that he was working with all of these components. Yes, he obscures them in a collection of other possibilities, but the essential elements are all present and explicitly defined. Here's one of my personal favorite quotes from Tesla. He says, "Whatever electricity may be, it is a fact that it behaves like an incompressible fluid, and the earth may be looked upon as an immense reservoir of electricity." Now, mind you, Nikola Tesla is the inventor of the polyphase electrical distribution system used all over the world today. And he says he doesn't know what electricity is, but that it definitely acts like a fluid under pressure. You think supposedly, this is his way of saying ether gas? And again, from the text of the article, Problems of Increasing Human Energy, just reading the highlighted sections here. Finally, however, I had the satisfaction of accomplishing the task undertaken by the use of a new principle, the virtue of which is based on the marvelous properties of the electrical condenser. One of these is that it can discharge or explode its stored energy in an inconceivably short time. Another of its properties, equally valuable, is that its discharge may vibrate at any rate desired up to many millions per second. I arranged such an instrument so as to be charged and discharged alternately in rapid succession through a coil with few turns of stout wire forming the primary of a transformer of induction coil. And then down here it says, electrical effects of any desired character and of intensities undreamed of before are now easily producible by perfected apparatus of this kind, to which frequent reference has been made, and the essential parts of which are shown in Figure 6. For certain purposes, a strong inductive effect is required. For others, the greatest possible suddenness. For others, again, an exceptionally high rate of vibration or extreme pressure. While for certain other objects, immense electrical movements are necessary. So here we have ample references in Tesla's own words, which are extremely supportive of Jerry Vassalato's main thesis, that Tesla was working with these things. He was charging capacitors with high voltage DC sources. He was discharging them through magnetically quenched spark gaps. And he was doing this at extremely high rates of vibration, even up to many millions of times per second. And that this was the method of operating his magnifying transmitter. And that this device produces and captures what Tesla called radiant energy. The question is, in spite of all of this written evidence, do we have any direct proof that Tesla's magnifying transmitter produces a different form of electricity? To answer that, I submit this photograph. Taken in 1986 of a discharge from Eric Dollard's magnifying transmitter and provided to me by Tom Brown in New Zealand. The wooden top of the coil is about 8 inches across. The voltage represented by this discharge is anybody's guess. but certainly must be approaching 400,000 volts. The other end of the coil is driving more than 4 amperes into the ground connection, measured on a radio frequency ammeter, and the entire system is drawing less than 2,000 watts from the wall. Here we can see an imperfectly purified etheric discharge, complete with blue dartlets on the edges, as Tesla describes. I have no idea. Quick,
Yeah.
right.
Well, you wouldn't see the structure stable like that.
At this point, I would like to submit for your serious consideration the idea that all of the material that I read to you from Jerry Vasilato's book, Secrets of Cold War Technology, is essentially correct. To summarize, Tesla accidentally discovered an electrostatic supercharging effect while trying to verify Hertz's discovery of electromagnetic waves. After hundreds of experiments, he learned how to control and maximize this phenomena. This led him to the discovery that electricity is made up of different components that can be separated from each other, and that a pure, gaseous, etheric energy can be fractionated away from the flow of electrons in a circuit designed to produce short-duration, unidirectional impulses. When all the conditions were right, this gaseous, etheric energy would manifest itself as a spatially distributed voltage that would radiate away from the electrical circuit as a light-like ray that could charge other surfaces within the field. From now on, I would like to refer to this phenomena as the electroradiant event and summarize its characteristics as follows. The electroradiant event is produced when a high-voltage direct current is discharged across a spark gap and interrupted abruptly. This effect is greatly increased when the source of direct current is a charged capacitor. The electroradiant event leaves wires and other circuit components perpendicular to the flow of current. The electroradiant event produces a spatially distributed voltage that can be thousands of times higher than the initial spark discharge voltage. It propagates instantaneously as a longitudinal electrostatic light-like ray that behaves similarly to an incompressible gas under pressure. Electroradiant effects are solely characterized by impulse duration. Electroradiant effects penetrate all materials and create electronic responses in metals like copper and silver. And in this case, electronic responses means electron movements are initiated. Electroradiant impulses shorter than 100 microseconds are completely safe to handle and will not cause shock or harm. And electroradiant impulses shorter than 100 nanoseconds are cold and easily cause lighting effects in vacuum globes. The electroradiant event is essentially the gain mechanism, which Tesla discovered, that is the basis of his magnifying transmitter. It is the basis of his claim that he was able to create more energy in his outputs than it took to initiate them in his inputs. Now, what I'd like to do is go back to Gray. Just so we can understand what this circuit is, on the left, I have the schematic as it is in Gray's patent. And I show the patent number, everything. This part is straight from the patent. On the right, I'm showing what I call my simplified Gray circuit schematic. And I'm using the term schematic here in quotations, and I keep putting it in quotations because it's not entirely a schematic drawing, and we'll get to that shortly. But what I'd like to do first is eliminate a number of components that are redundancies so we can get down to the basic elements of what this circuit is. First of all, this section over here in Figure 5, this is just an alternate way of running the circuit from an AC supply, and we can eliminate that without changing the circuit in any significant way. So over here, I just have the thing running directly from the batteries.
What is the element number 36? What is that device?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Secondly, components 42, 44, and 46. 42, 44, 46. We talked about these earlier. These are simply safety overshoot mechanisms, and we're just going to eliminate those because we know from reading earlier that these are in the circuit simply to protect the circuit in case it generates too much electricity. We'll stick them back in later, but for now, let's just remove them so we aren't confused by them. Component 26, I believe that's this. Gray calls this a commutator. This is part of the timing mechanism. But component 28, right here, which is a vacuum triode, is sufficient to give us timing impulses for the discharge of our capacitor. So that's sufficient. So we can eliminate 26. And component 48 here. This is just a switching mechanism that allows you to change which battery is being charged and which battery is actually running the circuit. So if we just eliminate that over here, we can simply say that battery 18 is running the circuit and battery 40 is receiving the charging impulses. So now we have what I call the simplified Gray circuit schematic. And this will be helpful in the next analysis. Is everybody okay with these changes? This doesn't change anything in any appreciable way? So here I've placed Tesla's magnifying transmitter circuit next to Gray's cold electricity circuit. And here are the common features of these two. One, they both start off with a source of high voltage direct current. In the case of Tesla, it's a high voltage direct current generator. And in Gray's case, we start with a battery. We chop it through this multi-vibrator, run it through this step-up transformer, rectify it, and charge the capacitor there. Either way, we create high voltage DC. Next in line in the circuit is the capacitor. And we see this in Tesla's circuit, we see this in Gray's circuit. Next thing both circuits do is discharge the capacitor through a spark gap. And that spark gap is characterized by two things. First, by a means to ensure that there's a unidirectional discharge. In other words, that there are no reversals of current in the discharge. And second, that there's a means to control the impulse duration. In the case of Tesla's circuit, we have a magnetic field or hot air or a number of other things across the spark gap to blow out the current as soon as it appears. And the duration of the spark can be also determined by both the strength of the magnetic field and the capacitance of the capacitor. In the case of Gray, we know Gray was using very large capacitors, so he was not dumping the entire capacitor when he discharged. But he was doing two things. He had a resistor, which would limit the current, and he also had this vacuum tube, which he could use to shut off the discharge at whatever pulse duration he was interested in. So all these features are present. Next, we have in both circuits what I will call the preferred location for the electroradiant event. In Tesla's case, it was his 2 turns of stout wire, forming the primary of his electrical transformer. But as we know from reading Jerry Vassilatos, we know that this was not an inductive transformer, that the magnetic coupling in this is very weak from the primary to the secondary. In fact, the primary runs on what Tesla calls his new electrostatic induction rules. And in the case of gray, the preferred electroradiant event, the location is what he calls his conversion switching tube, which clearly is an electrostatic device, as we read earlier. It is specifically designed to have an explosive electrostatic event radiate away from its central member. The next element is the preferred means to intercept the electroradiant event. In Tesla's case, it's the secondary coil, conical-shaped coil that Jerry talks about, we see in the patents. In Gray's case, he just collects the radiant voltage on these charge-receiving grids. It's important to see that in both of these circuits, there is no direct connection between the source of energy and the receiver element. There is only the electrostatically induced charge on these members. The next element is the connection to the preferred output. In Tesla's case, the output is the connection to the ground and the elevated capacitance, which constitutes his world broadcast system. In Gray's case, he discharged the accumulated charges of his charge-receiving grids into either the jumping magnets or a transformer output that ran his cold electric circuit, or into the repulsive magnets in his motor. So again, they each have a preferred means to intercept the electroradiant event and a preferred method to connect it to the output. And finally, in Gray's case, he was able to reconvert some of this excess energy back into ordinary electricity, enough to actually recharge his battery, as we saw earlier from the articles. Tesla was not concerned with this, since his system was designed to be powered by a hydroelectric power plant. So it's clear from this analysis, just in case anybody missed it up till now, that Tesla's magnifying transmitter and Gray's cold electricity circuits are for all intents and purposes the same circuit. They do the same things in the same places in slightly different ways, and they both claim to produce extremely high gains of a cold form of electrostatic energy in the output. Tesla's system was obviously much, much larger. He was planning to power up the whole world. Gray was only planning to power up your home or your car. But for all intents and purposes, these systems function the same and release the same electroradiant gain mechanism. So here again is Gray's circuit schematic from the patent. And again, I've used the term schematic here in quotations, and I'm going to get into exactly why I'm doing that right now.
You ask a question?
Please hold it.
Okay.
One of the things that finally allowed me to figure out how this circuit works and what the real schematic is was when I was looking at this. I realized there were a number of basic problems in the way this was drawn. We're going to look at component 42 here. Remember that this is a spark overshoot device. Now, as it's drawn, you can see a little line connecting right there. Connects all the way around and would actually produce a short circuit so that it would not allow capacitor 16 to charge up. So if this was an actual electrical connection, it looks like the circuit wouldn't do what they say it would do. So we clearly see that this part of the drawing has problems. Secondly, component 28. Here. This is defined in the patent as follows. It says, control of the conversion switching element tube is maintained by commutator 26, a series of contacts mounted radially about a shaft, or a solid-state switching device sensitive to time or other variable may be used for this control element. A switching element tube type one-way energy path, 28, is introduced between the commutator device and the conversion switching element tube to prevent high-energy arcing at the commutator current path. Now, of course, if the commutator was a solid-state device, there wouldn't be any arcing to prevent. So we can see again the important thing about 28 isn't that it's going to prevent arcing here, but that it's described as a one-way energy path. He is specifically saying that energy in this circuit can only be allowed to move in one direction at this stage. That is what is extremely important, not preventing arcing at 26. In this we can see strict compliance with the conditions which Tesla set forth. The other thing about this is that the grid on the triode here isn't attached to anything. And of course, that's what controls the pulse duration. So here's a gaping hole in the patent, and there's no mention of what kind of frequencies or pulse durations this tube is supposed to operate at, no connection to the mechanism that would control that, i.e. the grid of the tube. So this was a big tip-off for me. This is typical of Gray's patents, where he leaves out extremely important details that are actually the heart of the matter. The other thing here is 36. This component here. We see this is the inductive load somehow. We see these odd arrows, one pointing this way, one kind of rolling out this way, implying that possibly this inductor is going to be deflected in some way, possibly by another inductor similarly opposed to it. But we don't see any real current path through this. We don't see a coil symbol illustrated like here, where we clearly see the schematic connections and the coils. So I came to view this whole section of the circuit as more of a block diagram than an actual schematic. Again, we move out here, and it goes to this second capacitor, which is obviously part of the recharging mechanism. But again, none of this makes any sense. If these impulses start charging up 38, there's no way for these impulses to discharge in any way, and that capacitor is just going to charge up, and eventually everything will just stop. So again, all we know is that the charge-receiving grids are in some relationship to the inductive load, which is in some relationship to the receiving capacitor, which is in some relationship to the recharging battery. But this is more of a block diagram, just showing that these things are in relationship to each other, rather than showing exactly how they are wired together. As we move towards a complete understanding of what Gray's schematic diagram may actually look like, the next thing I'd like to do is look at his conversion element switching tube, since this is the heart of the matter. This is what was always referred to in the earlier articles as that super secret means of generating and mixing static electricity. This is the element where the free energy is generated and collected. So here we have, from Gray's patent, diagram the switching element conversion tube, and we see that the spark gap here, this needs to be set for the voltage that we're going to discharge our primary capacitor at, and that's set for about 3,000 volts. The rear extension of what Gray calls his high voltage anode, which is this central element here, is the surface from which the electroradiant event will be projected. And as we can see, it will radiate perpendicular to the flow of current in the spark discharge path moving down that surface. This material is clearly represented as a relatively thick material. It's not just a wire. Its characteristics? We don't know anything about them from the patent. The patent doesn't describe them. But we do know it's going to be radiating a light-like ray. And so we might think of this material as something that will possibly be like a mirror-finished stainless steel or a non-magnetic material of some kind. There's a wide variety of things that can be tested, but very possibly its diameter will become important as well. Whether it's solid or whether it's hollow may also be important. These are the things that will need to be explored. These concentric charge-receiving grids are designed to gather the electroradiant charge that comes off. As we stated before, the patent states, this element utilizes a low-voltage anode, a high-voltage anode, and one or more electrostatic or charge-receiving grids. This is important. This drawing clearly shows 2 charge-receiving grids. And there are reasons to believe that he worked with both systems that had 1 or 2. We'll go into this shortly. But here we have the section from Gray's patent which talks about this component. And we'll just start at the top here, and it says, the shape and spacing of the electrostatic grids is also susceptible to variations of application, voltage, current, and energy requirements. It is the contention of the inventor that by judicious mating of the elements of the conversion switching element tube and the proper selection of the components of the circuit elements of the system, the desired theoretical results may be achieved. It is the inventor's contention that this mating and selection process is well within the capabilities of intensive research and development technique. This is Gray's very nice way of saying, that's all I'm gonna tell you. But you can probably figure it out if you know what you're doing. Then we skip down here. And it's about here. The preferred embodiment of this invention merely assumes optimum utilization and optimum benefit from this invention when used with portable energy devices similar to, in principle, to the wet cell or dry cell battery. This invention proposes to utilize the energy contained in an internally generated high voltage energy spike to electrically energize an inductive load, this inductive load being then capable of converting the energy so supplied into a useful electrical or mechanical output. So, mechanical output would be the motor, electrical output would be the solid-state circuit that he was running in the first article. So, here we have clear statements by Gray that this is the important element. This is what powered his magnet popping experiment. This is what ran his circuit, that ran the TVs and radios and light bulbs, and this is the circuit that ran his motor. This is the element where the energy is both magnified and characterized as cold electricity. From now on, I would like to call this structure an electroradiant transceiver, because it is designed to both broadcast and receive the electroradiant event. So what else do we know about this element at this point? There appears to be no provision in these drawings, at least, to determine whether or not there's a vacuum in here or if it's air or some other gas. We do have quotes from Gray saying that he learned about lightning. He noticed that it was stronger near the ground, and he assumed that it had something to do with more air. If you remember that quote. So I'm going to assume that this is not a vacuum environment and that this is simply enclosed to protect people from being shocked by the capacitor discharge more than anything. Of course, we know that the output cold electricity doesn't shock you. So we're going to consider the enclosure of this at this point mostly as a mechanical means of holding the components together, and that there's probably air in this component. Now, we don't know what the physical size of this thing is, and we don't know what the physical dimensions are of the charge receiving grids, how long they are, how big in diameter, etc. until we go back to the photographic evidence of Tom Valentine. So here we have Ed Gray standing before the meeting of his stockholders in 1977. We saw this image in black and white form earlier as part of Tom Valentine's newsreel article. Mr. Valentine was very kind to loan me this archive and give me access to this color slide and a number of other black and white images of Gray's laboratory that I've been showing you before. Right down here, we see the magic component where the sparks are flying. We can see quite a bit in this photograph about the layout of the device. We can see the dimensions of the conversion switching element tubes and what I'm calling the electro-radiant transceivers. He has 3 of them right in a row, and each one of them is being fed by the discharge of a single capacitor. So he's got 3 very large capacitors here, 1, 2, 3. I actually had this image digitally scanned, and when I looked at the markings on this capacitor here, it says 2 microfarads at 4,000 volts DC. This is the entire output setup. So where his motor patent shows he's got banks and banks of capacitors that are being charged and discharged in series, sequence, and all these different things, that's not what he was doing. This is what he was doing. Another thing it suggested, look here. You got 1 wire coming out of each one of these things. You got 3 wires going into the commutator and 1 wire coming out. So Gray is most probably discharging the charge receiving grids to ground through his magnets. Digital close-up of this image clearly shows 2 charge receiving grids in the tube, about 1/4 of an inch away from each other. Exactly how they are connected is still not certain. The patent suggests that each grid is wired out to the plug and that 1 connection from there is made to the output inductor. So what exactly is the output setup? Here we have another unpublished photograph taken by Tom Valentine in Ed Gray's laboratory in 1973. You can see Ed Gray and Fritz Lenz with Richard Hackenberger hacked off there. This is the setup that they were popping the magnets with. You can see right here in the foreground. Air core transformer wound on a 4-inch piece of PVC. I believe this is the circuit element that is probably taking the discharge from the conversion element switching tubes and inductively coupling it to the secondary windings and powering the magnets, wired in series to make them fly away from each other. So you can see that to create repulsive impulses that are timed perfectly to each other, he has an air core transformer powering the magnets simultaneously. Why is he using an air core transformer in the first stage? Because the impulse frequency is so high. Close-up of this image shows this central winding has 2 layers of 10 turns of what looks like spark plug wire. And so this is the inductive load. This is how he's getting energy out of the conversion element switching tube, charge receiving grids, and starting to do real work with it. So now we have enough evidence at this point to speculate on what Ed Gray's cold electricity circuit schematic might actually be. Here's what I call the probable schematic for Edwin Gray's cold electricity circuit. As you can see, the whole front end is identical to Gray's drawing, with the battery, multi-vibrator, step-up transformer, full-wave bridge, and capacitor, along with the protective mechanisms 42, 44, and 46. Next, the electro-radiant transceiver mechanism, spark gap, resistor, vacuum tube, and then around, is that off the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you just
Move it.
Yeah, just move it slightly.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, and then back around to the positive of the battery. just like in Gray's circuit. Connected to the grid of the triode, we're going to put a timing mechanism that can produce pulse trains as needed, pulse durations between 10 and 50 microseconds. The output section, I'm showing two grids connected together here. Powering the primary, the air core transformer, discharging to ground. Secondary of the transformer is a step down to power lights and other things in this zone, as well as another step down transformer that would be, whose secondary would be rectified to charge another capacitor. Pulses coming through here will charge this capacitor until the voltage is higher than the battery, and so would start charging the secondary battery with current pulses. Going back to the spark overshoot mechanism here, 42. I'm showing this as two separate high voltage spark gaps, one on the primary line to dump any electroradiant event that backs up through the primary line, and the second one to dump any excess voltage in the output line. Going back to vacuum tube 28. To create the non-shocking form of electricity, it must limit the spark duration to anything less than 100 microseconds, according to Tesla. We know from Dr. Chalfon's statement that Gray uses power, quote, for only a small fraction of a millisecond. I think 1% to 5% of a millisecond represents a small fraction. And so it's in that range. 10 to 50 microseconds. The vacuum tube also acts like a diode, so it's very resistant to reversals in current. Now, as I've said before, the capacitor 16 here discharges through the electroradiant transceiver back to the positive of the battery. Now, normally, if we just discharge this capacitor, you would discharge the high voltage positive back to the negative here. Normal discharge path would be like down through here, through this spark gap here, just back to the negative. But Gray discharges it back to the positive of the battery. Tesla clearly shows that this is not necessary to create the electroradiant event, but it is certainly part of the circuit process that Gray felt was necessary. We don't know exactly what significance it is, but it's certainly related to his idea of splitting the positive, which was a piece of jargon used early in the reporting that we didn't understand. But this is clearly what splitting the positive looked like to Gray. Clearly, this is not about recharging the battery. The voltage drop at the spark gap reduces the amount of energy that can go back to the battery to near zero. So this is not the recharging mechanism. This is probably simply about characterizing the electroradiant event in a more positive way, and in this way I mean electropositive. So now we have some grasp of where the terminology splitting the positive comes from and what its significance might be. Also, that Gray claims to be only using a positive form of energy. Certainly what gets radiated out to his charge receiving grids is a positive electrostatic charge. When that is discharged to ground, he is only using the positive side of the electricity. So at least, again, everything Gray was saying makes sense. Digital close-ups of the charge receiving grid strongly suggest Gray is using copper. You can see a yellowish color in there. As we have said before, electroradiant events create electronic responses in certain metals. So Gray must have figured out that he could recreate electron movements from the primary electroradiant event if he intercepted it on copper. In other words, downstep the electroradiant event down towards more normal electricity again. In Tesla's large-scale system, he tried to get away from this effect. But in Gray's smaller system, it's just what he needed. The more we ask the electroradiant event to interact with copper again, the sooner we get back to a form of electricity that will actually charge the battery in a fairly normal way. This then is how to produce Edwin Gray's cold electricity. It is cold in the sense that it won't shock you. So this is how the system works. To summarize again, Gray's cold electricity circuit runs like this. It starts with power from this battery. He raises the voltage to 3,000 volts DC, and he stores it on his very large capacitor. He then discharges impulses through the spark gap, clipped by this vacuum tube, such that the impulse duration is less than 100 microseconds. This staccato of impulses flows through the electroradiant transceiver, which creates a series of radiant electrostatic fields of spatially distributed voltage that is picked up by the charge-receiving grids. As soon as the electroradiant event ceases, the charged grids discharge to ground through the primary of the inductive load. The output recovery system is inductively coupled to this discharge primary with a voltage step down to run lights and other medium voltage appliances, as well as other step-down transformers to recharge the secondary battery. By switching the batteries back and forth periodically, Gray could keep the system going indefinitely and still produce a sizable output. Gray's statement that he only used 1% of the energy and that 99% of the went back into the battery is actually a meaningless attempt to define this phenomena in thermodynamic terms. Actually, all the energy in his primary circuit is lost, and the energy recovered from the electroradiant event is about 100 times greater. Now, for those of you who are still slightly skeptical about the manner in which this device works, I submit to you this. Here is the classic image of the enigmatic Testotica machine designed by Paul Baumann at the Methernitha community in Linden, Switzerland. Mr. Baumann claims he learned how to build this device by studying lightning. As you can see, he's got a Wimshurst machine, has the high voltage electrostatic front end. This charges 2 capacitors. Or Leyden jars. The high voltage from these capacitors goes down through the tops of these big cans, which Mr. Baumann has never let anyone see inside. Then it comes out the bottoms and meets in a spark gap. There's been endless speculation as to what these devices are, ranging from uranium-doped capacitors to strange arrangements of crystals and magnets and all kinds of other things. I submit to you that these big cans are electroradiant transceivers and that they are not altogether different from Gray's conversion tube design. What is interesting here is that Mr. Baumann has one on either side of the spark gap. One of these probably produces a positive electroradiant event, and the other produces a negative electroradiant event. So we finally see here a balanced system. Like Tesla said, depending on where the spark gap was, you could either project a charge or deplete a charge from a surface. So here we have the full manifestation of this type of circuit, where the output pulses actually resolve the charge from an electroradiant positive surface to an electroradiant negative surface, instead of just from one grid to ground, like in Gray's system. Baumann further characterizes the energy flowing between the charge receiving grids by wrapping the wires around these permanent magnets. Again, doing everything he can to make it behave more like ordinary electricity once he's collected it. In this second image here, you can clearly see that this little Wimshurst machine has no trouble making big lighting effects. The claim here in this image is for 1,000 watts of light. And again, we must be looking at close to 1,000 to 1 gain, not to mention the fact that the machine is turning itself. There are literally thousands of variants to what I have presented here tonight. So if you can't go home and build a cold electricity circuit from old nylon records, aluminum foil, paper clips, and magnets, it's not my fault. In closing, I would just like to say a few more words about the ether. I have had the great good fortune in the last 10 years to be the understudy of one of the great masters of ether physics alive today, Trevor Constable. His study of the ether's behavior in the earth and atmosphere has given me countless opportunities to see firsthand the astonishing power of the ether. The model of the ether that we have found to be of the most utility is that set of ideas put forward by Dr. Rudolf Steiner. In this model, there are 4 primary octaves of the ether. These are the light ether, the warmth ether, the chemical ether, and the integrated synthesis of these 3 he calls the life ether. Steiner describes electricity as an unnatural combination of warmth ether and light ether. The term unnatural here simply means not found in nature. While these terms are slightly different, you may be able to see the parallels between this idea and the conclusions that Tesla was arriving at. The light ether is related to voltage, capacitance, and the dielectric forces in nature, whereas the warmth ether is related to current, resistance, and the magnetic forces in nature. Longitudinal waves in the light ether propagate instantaneously to any distance, even interstellar and intergalactic distances. This medium is cool and not wholly responsive to what is generally referred to as electrical resistance. This means that even Ohm's law is useless in determining circuit behaviors when this medium is present. More importantly, however, this relates to the great quest for the so-called room temperature superconductor. I submit to you that the scientific community is again looking in the wrong direction. A purified stream of light ether is the true room temperature superconductee, and it will travel down a wide variety of mirror finish silver metals and transparent plastic polymers. Electricity is not a monolithic event, and it is definitely not simply the movement of electrons. Tesla proved that electricity can be split into its warmth ether and light ether fractions. When this happens, the light ether speeds ahead, leaving the warmth ether behind and releasing a natural abundance. It is imperative for modern-day researchers to understand that the laws of thermodynamics and Maxwell's equations do not define the total set of possible realities that can be investigated in electrical science. Besides Tesla, Gray, and Baumann, there have been at least 4 other inventors who also discovered how to tap the ether and make it do useful work. And they are John Keeley in 1872, Nathan B. Stubblefield in 1880, Thomas Henry Moray in 1926, and Dr. Wilhelm Reich in 1940. There are probably many others whose work I do not know. In light of this, there is ample evidence to suggest that God has been trying to give the peoples of this world etheric technology for over 120 years. It is time to wake up and graciously accept the divine gift. Thank you very much. There are a few things I'd like to do. There's a list of thank yous that I'd like to throw on the record here, and then we can open it up to questions if everybody isn't tired already. First of all, I'd like to thank Tom Valentine for aggressively pursuing the story on Ed Gray, for excellent and accurate reporting, for his tremendously revealing photographs, and for his exceptional generosity in loaning me his entire file archive as I started to prepare this presentation. None of this would be happening without his contribution. I'd like to thank Eric Dollard for being the first one in this generation to truly understand Nikola Tesla's work with impulse currents, and for repeatedly demonstrating this knowledge with experimental apparatus. I would like to thank Jerry Vassilatos for so brilliantly articulating and accurately conveying the story of Tesla's discoveries. And I'd like to thank David Hatcher Childress, the publisher of Jerry's book, for giving me the unusually wide latitude in quoting such large sections so that I could bring this story out more completely. I'd like to thank Dr. Robert Beck for encouraging me in my early work many years ago, and for setting the example of the only way we can really have these things is to give them away. Thank you. I'd like to thank the late Bruce De Palma for teaching me how to think about physics, the way things really are. I'd like to thank Trevor Constable for erasing all doubt in my mind about the reality of the ether, and for relentlessly pursuing its practical application for the betterment of humanity. I'd like to thank Tom Brown, who's in New Zealand right now, who opened so many doors for me and actually introduced me to most of the people I've just mentioned. And finally, to all those other people who have supported my work over the years, and especially Don Maloney, whose unbidden generosity helped me so often through the lean times, and Michael Knox, who actually built the first machine I ever saw that produced free energy. So again, thank you, thank you, thank you. At this time, I'll take questions.
This energy going into space.
Hold it.
We're going to use a microphone. We'll get you on the table.
How far into space would this energy go?
Tesla never found the end. His magnifying transmitters were going to power the whole world. He could send the radiant event to all locations on the planet. His original plan was to power the entire world from Niagara Falls through his Wardenclyffe transmitter. And he was going to put two other redundant systems, one in South Africa and one in Asia somewhere, just to make sure that if one of them went down, the whole system didn't go down. But basically that he could power the whole world from one transmitter.
Powering the shuttle. We don't know.
I seem to understand it that these ether streams, that these ether streams, when they intersect metals, or when metals are intercepting these ether streams, cause electronic events?
Originally, Tesla thought that the ether gas created an impact which dislodged electrons. What he eventually came to believe was that the metallic lattice actually coalesced the ether gas into electrons, and so that the metals actually manufactured electrons because they could just do it continuously without changing the metal. The metal didn't fatigue under this action and all this kind of stuff.
Thank you.
The microphone's coming around. Yeah.
Does this mean then, depending on the metal used, you had different properties, different qualities
Yes.
of the effects?
Yes.
The other question I wanted to ask, when Tesla was doing this additional research, trying to prove Hertz's thesis, did he do this in New York or did he do this up at Pikes Peak in Colorado?
He went to Pikes Peak in 1899. This was all happening in New York. This was 10 years before.
Then what did he get out of the lightning rods up at Pikes Peak?
That was the culmination of his. That was the very first and largest magnifying transmitter that he actually built and operated.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I must compliment you on your research. You've done an excellent job. And I think you'll find that Mr. Gray's transceiver would have to function at a minimum frequency of 20 kilohertz in order to split the incoming dipoles. Then you can take the electron, which will then be coupled with the etheric carrier, and then split those. But from my own experiments, I find anything less than 20 kilohertz, you can't split the dipoles. But I find once you do, yes, the problem then is not generating tremendous energy, it's limiting it. You need a really good voltage divider usually, because I find a lot of my incoming spikes are well over 1,000 amps. Mm-hmm. And it gets really frightening.
Yeah, bummer,
yes.
huh?
Yeah, but it's, definitely this kind of circuit, it's for real.